They said she couldn't run the ferry alone. She ran it better than the man who quit. The Sage River ferry had been running since before the war. A flat-bottomed raft on a cable, stretched between two cottonwood posts, carrying wagons and livestock and people across 60 feet of brown water that looked slow from the bank, but pulled like a team of horses once you were on it. Reed Halsey had run the ferry for 9 years. His father had run it for 20 before that, and the cable was strung so tight you could hear it hum when the wind came down the valley. Reed was 33 years old, built long and lean, with the calloused hands and sunburned neck of a man who had spent his life outdoors. He walked with a limp now, the left knee swollen and stiff where the mule had kicked him in March, and the doctor in Sage River had told him the joint was cracked in a way that might heal and might not. The ferry required 2 good legs. The cable mechanism demanded weight and leverage. The loading ramp needed a man who could brace against the current, and the livestock did not care whether the ferryman was injured. Reed had tried to work through the pain for 6 weeks and had finally admitted what the river had been telling him every day. He could not do this alone, and he could not do it at all. The humiliation of it was worse than the pain. Reed had never asked anyone for help, not once in 33 years. His father had taught him that a man who could not do his own work was a man who owed somebody, and owing somebody was one step from losing what you had. But the river did not negotiate, and the knee did not negotiate, and the ferry sat idle on the bank while wagons backed up on both sides, and the ranchers talked about bridges and bypasses and every other option that did not include Reed Halsey. He had hired a man named Wick Sandifer to take over the daily crossings. Wick lasted 3 weeks. He was strong enough, but careless, and he let a wagon drift into the shallows on a Tuesday afternoon, and then blamed the current, which was the river's way of saying he did not understand it. On a Friday morning, Wick collected his pay and rode south without explanation, and Reed was left standing on the bank with a swollen knee and a ferry that was the only crossing for 40 miles in either direction. Calla Dunbar arrived the following Monday. She rode a gray mare and led a pack mule, and she came to the ferry landing and looked at the raft and the cable and the brown water moving beneath them with the expression of someone who was evaluating a piece of equipment. "I heard you need a ferryman," she said. Reed looked at her from the bench where he spent most of his days now, his bad legs stretched out in front of him. She was perhaps 27, tall for a woman, with strong shoulders and a face that was more handsome than pretty. Square jaw, clear gray eyes, sun-darkened skin. She wore men's trousers and a canvas coat, and her hair was braided back in a single rope that hung between her shoulder blades. "I need a ferryman," he said, "not a ferrywoman. The river does not care who pulls the cable. The river does not care who pulls the cable. The river does not care who pulls the cable. The river does not care who pulls the cable. The ranchers who cross their herds here might." "Then the ranchers can swim," she said. "I can work the mechanism. I can handle livestock. I have run a freight line in Idaho for 4 years. Show me the cable and the ramp, and I will prove it." Reed looked at her for a long time. He had no other applicants. The ferry had been idle for 3 days, and the ranchers on the far side were already talking about building a bridge, which would take 2 years and would put him out of business. "Fine," he said. "Show me." She showed him. She walked the length of the raft, testing the planks with her boot heel. She examined the cable mechanism, a system of pulleys, and a hand-cranked windlass that moved the ferry across the current. She cranked the windlass with smooth, even strokes, her shoulders flexing under the canvas coat, and the ferry slid across the water as smoothly as it had when Reed had worked it himself. She tested the loading ramp, leaning her weight against it, and she walked the cable posts and checked the tension with her hand against the wire. "The splice on the upstream side is fraying," she said. "It needs rewrapping before the spring runoff." Reed stared at her. Wick had not noticed the splice in 3 weeks. "You can start tomorrow," he said. Calla Dunbar started that afternoon. She ran the first crossing by herself, a wagon loaded with flour barrels and a team of draft horses that outweighed her by a factor of 10. She talked to the horses the way people talk to horses who understood them, low and firm, and the team stood quiet on the raft while she cranked the windlass and the brown water slid beneath them. Reed watched from the bank with his hands on his bad knee, and an expression he could not have named if someone had asked him to. The town talked, because the town always talked. A woman running the ferry was irregular, and irregular things in small frontier towns attracted attention the way sugar attracted flies. Gus Mercer at the general store said it was unnatural. Hattie Flynn at the boarding house said it was a sign of the times, and did not mean it as a compliment. The ranchers who brought their cattle to the crossing stood on the bank and watched Calla work the cable and the ramp with the skepticism of men who believed that strength was measured in weight lifted rather than work accomplished. Boyd Kershaw was the worst of them. He ran the biggest ranch in the valley, 3,000 head, and he crossed cattle at the ferry 4 times a year. He stood on the bank during the first crossing of his spring herd and watched Calla load the first 20 head onto the raft with the compressed attention of a man looking for a mistake. "One woman," he said to Reed, who was sitting on his bench, "working my cattle on a river that has drowned 2 men. She knows what she is doing," Reed said. "She knows what she thinks she is doing. That is not the same thing." Reed said nothing to that. He had learned in the weeks since Calla started that arguing on her behalf was unnecessary. She did not need defending. She needed the ranchers to watch her work, and once they watched, the argument resolved itself. It was a kind of persuasion that required no words, only repetition, and Calla had the patience for it. But the cattle crossed, all 3,000 head, over the course of 2 days, 20 at a time, and Calla worked the cable and the ramp and the livestock with a competence that was so steady and so unremarkable that it became its own kind of argument. She did not hurry. She did not shout. She read the current the way a good horseman reads a horse, anticipating its shifts before they happened. And when a young steer panicked on the raft and tried to jump, she caught the lead rope and braced against the railing and held the animal until it steadied, all without losing her grip on the windlass. Boyd Kershaw paid the crossing fee without comment, which from Boyd Kershaw was the closest thing to praise anyone had ever received. Reed watched all of this from the bank. He watched the way she tied the mooring lines, the way she greased the pulleys, the way she rewrapped the fraying splice on the upstream cable with wire and tar so neatly that it looked like it had been done by a rigger. He watched the way she moved on the raft, balanced and sure, and he understood that she was not merely competent. She was gifted. She understood the river the way he understood it, as a living thing with moods and patterns that could be read but never fully predicted. He began to rely on her. It happened gradually, the way a man shifts his weight onto a new leg when the old one fails. She handled the daily crossings, and he handled the accounts, and the maintenance, and the correspondence with the territorial office that held the ferry license. They worked alongside each other, with the efficiency of 2 people who respected each other's space and skills, and the ferry ran better than it had in years. One evening in June, Calla sat on the bank with her boots off, her feet in the shallows, while Reed sat on his bench and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. The river was low and slow, and the cottonwoods were full of starlings. "Why did you really come here?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Because the freight line went under. Because my partner stole the last 2 wagons and disappeared. Because I had a gray mare and a pack mule, and no place to go, and I heard about a ferry that needed running." "You could have done anything." "I could have, but I like rivers. I like the way they move. I like knowing that the current is always there, always pulling, and that the job is to work with it instead of against it." She looked at him. "You understand that?" "I do. Most people fight the river. You built a ferry that uses it. That is a different kind of intelligence." Reed felt something shift in his chest, a thing he had kept closed and quiet for the months, since the injury had taken the ferry from him and left him sitting on a bench watching someone else do the work he loved. He had expected to resent her. He had expected to feel diminished by her competence, the way a man whose body has failed him sometimes feels diminished by someone whose body has not. Instead, he felt grateful, and something more than grateful. He felt seen. It was a strange thing, being seen by someone who understood the specific shape of your loss. Other people sympathized. They said they were sorry about his knee, and they meant it. and then they moved on to their own concerns. Calla did not sympathize. She understood. She had lost her freight line and her partner, and everything she had built over 4 years, and she had gotten on her gray mare and ridden until she found work, because that was what a person did when the alternative was stopping. "My knee is not getting better," he said. It was the first time he had said it aloud. "I know," she said. "The doctor says I may walk without the limp eventually, but the strength will not come back the way it was. Not for the windlass. Not for the ramp. I know that too." "Then you know I need you to stay." She looked at the river. The starlings were moving in the cottonwoods, a great shifting cloud of wings and sound. "I was planning to stay," she said. "You did not need to ask." The summer deepened. The river dropped to its lowest point in August, and the ferry crossings were easy, the water barely reaching the raft's deck boards. Calla used the low water to repair the cable posts, digging out the old cottonwood trunks and replacing them with treated pine that would last another 20 years. She did the work herself, waist deep in the river, while Reed directed from the bank and handed her tools, and tried not to notice the way the water darkened her hair and the sun caught the muscles in her arms. He noticed anyway. He built a proper shelter on the bank where she could eat her midday meal out of the sun, with a bench and a small table, and a tin roof that rang when it rained. She did not ask for it. He did not explain it. It appeared one morning while she was running the first crossing, and when she came back to the bank and saw it, she looked at him with an expression that was more eloquent than anything either of them had said in weeks. "It is just a shelter," he said. "It is not just a shelter," she said, and sat down on the bench and ate her lunch. And Reed watched the river and pretended that his heart was not doing something entirely undignified. He noticed everything about her. The way she whistled while she worked, tuneless and unconscious. The way she talked to the horses and the mules as though they were slow-witted but well-meaning colleagues. The way she ate, quickly, efficiently. The way a person eats who has not always been certain of the next meal. The way she looked at the river each morning before the first crossing, reading it the way he had once read it, checking for changes in the current and the color and the debris. The ranchers stopped commenting. The crossing fees were steady. The livestock losses were 0. And the ferry ran on time, which was more than anyone could have said for the last year of Reed's operation. Even Gus Mercer at the general store stopped calling it unnatural, though he would not go so far as to call it normal. In September, a storm came down the valley, and the river rose 4 feet in a night. The current turned fast and brown and full of debris, and the ferry was the only way across for the families on the far side who needed supplies. Calla ran the crossing in conditions that would have given Reed pause even in his best years. She worked the windlass against a current that was trying to tear the raft downstream, and she did it for 12 hours straight, crossing and recrossing, until every family that needed to get across had gotten across. Reed stood on the bank in the rain and watched her bring the last crossing in, the raft fighting the cable, the current roaring, and Calla cranking the windlass with a strength and a steadiness that made the watching men along the bank go quiet. When she tied off the mooring lines and stepped onto the bank, she was soaked through and shaking with exhaustion. Reed took off his coat and put it around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, and neither of them said anything, because the river had said it for them. Boyd Kershaw came to the ferry the next day. He stood on the bank and looked at the high water and the woman who had run the crossing through the storm. "I was wrong about her," he said to Reed. "Yes," Reed said, "you were." That evening, Reed asked Calla to marry him. He did it on the bank, with the river still running high, and the sunset turning the water to copper. He said he had been thinking about it since June, and that he would understand if she said no, because a man who could not work his own ferry was not much of an offer. Calla looked at the river and then at him. "You are the offer," she said. "The ferry is just the ferry." They were married in October by the circuit judge, on the raft, in the middle of the river, because Calla said if the river was going to be their life, it ought to be at their wedding. The judge held on to the railing and looked nervous. Boyd Kershaw served as a witness and did not look nervous at all. The ferry ran. The cable hummed in the wind. The woman who had come with nothing but a gray mare and a pack mule proved every day that competence had nothing to do with the body it lived in, and the man who had thought he was finished learned that some things do not end, they change hands.